All right, we're gonna get going here. Turn on my webcam for the initial introductions at the start, just so you guys can all see I'm a real person in a real room presenting this webinar today. Not brought to you by AI, not yet anyway. So thank you all for those of you that are joining live. For those of you that don't know who I am, I'm Chris Hansen here at E1 Solutions. I've been with the team for quite a few years now, and yeah, I'm involved in everything SmartConnect with our company. So once again, thank you to those joining live. Thank you to those that are watching this on a recording later as well. So a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First one, I believe this webinar is set for a full hour. I don't expect it to take us that long to get through what I want to cover. Again, for this session, the idea is to get us into the idea of both why webhooks are important, and then also how we can utilize them with SmartConnect. So we'll start kind of at the why level of it, and then we'll work into the technical details as we go through. What I don't want this to turn into, though, is like a full product training. So we're not going to go through every window step by step. This is to get you thinking of how you can utilize it either with your company or with your partners, or as a partner with your customers, and what you can do around integration design and how that's all going to fit together. Other housekeeping items, there is a question and answer in a chat panel as part of this webinar. So if you have any questions, go ahead and drop stuff in there. I'll try to check that periodically as we're going through. I don't mind answering questions as we're going, especially if it's something relevant to what I'm discussing or showing. So feel free to put things in there. If I miss it, I'll try to get to it at the end. So I apologize if that happens as well. So with that, we'll probably get going with the webinar here. I'm going to turn off my camera so I don't have to look at myself the whole time we're going through. But once again, thank you all for joining. All right. So again, everyone that's here, everyone that's watching, you are on our subscribing to and utilizing webhooks or using webhooks with SmartConnect webinar. So just recently, earlier this year, we put out an update for SmartConnect.com that included the functionality to allow SmartConnect to subscribe to webhooks. And we'll explain both what webhooks are, what it means when you subscribe to them as part of this session. But it's a new feature that's been added in. It's something that's not been available in SmartConnect up to this point, unless you did a lot of custom work around it. So it's really exciting that we have that added in to the product now. Just for clarification, at this point, as this webinar is going on, this is available inside of smartconnect.com. It's not available in our on-premise solution yet to this point. So everything I talk to today and show is going to be aimed at smartconnect.com, but this functionality will end up in both deployment types of the product. Now, what we have for our agenda today, first one is just an overview of webhooks. If there's someone jumping on this call, unsure of what exactly we mean when we're talking about it, we'll discuss that, what exactly they are. We'll talk about the benefits they provide when we're designing and setting up integrations and how that fits into SmartConnect. And then we'll start getting into a bit more of the technical details of determining if a REST API has webhooks, what that means, where you can go to try to find that information. And then finally, we'll show it within SmartConnect. We're not going to set one up from scratch, but I'm going to run through a couple predefined ones that we've got in place to give you an idea of what that looks like, how it fits into our different integration setup windows, and again, how that all hangs together. Finally, this last one, this is probably, it should be additional things, not additional thing, use case additional things to consider. That I'll probably be talking about as we go through the different topics in there. So I'll be scattering this throughout. If any of you have been on one of my presentations before, you know I do like to talk quite a bit, and I like to really explore each of the topics we go through in multiple details and angles as we consider it. So first, high level, what are webhooks and how do they function? So a webhook is something, and you've probably heard this term thrown around, even if you're not vastly knowledgeable about it yet at this point, but the idea behind a webhook is any application, generally like a web application or a web some web application has an API that sits on top of it. So if you've utilized SmartConnect to this point, you know we've got a REST API or a REST connector in there that allows us to connect to different REST APIs that we don't have a dedicated connector for. Now, beyond a product just having a REST API, or as part of it, they might have something they call webhooks. So what webhooks are is it allows other external applications like SmartConnect to tie into them or to subscribe to them. The term you're going to hear a lot is the term subscribe. Subscribe to a webhook so that if a particular event occurs in that application, you're going to see that webhook, well, what it's going to do, whether you see it or not, that webhook is going to push a notification out to any system that's subscribed to it. So in our case, with SmartConnect, if we're subscribing to these different events and these different webhooks, when that criteria is met or when that event occurs in that web application, it's going to do a push notification to us, to part of our product to say, hey, this occurred, here's the data, or here's like the reference or key or something, so that we know that that event has happened and we need to do something about it. Now, how this fits into SmartConnect, if I've got, there we go. How this fits into SmartConnect and how it relates to what we have already is, I talked about a little bit, we've got the REST connector in there that allows us to connect to these different REST APIs. Up to this point, we've always had to query that API and actually pull that data out. And that kind of ties into the third point on here as well, is up to this point, like if we're connecting to a Shopify or a Zendesk or Magento or you name it, something with the REST API, we've always had to go and set up a scheduled process to go ahead and pull that data down. So then it relies on us going ahead and trying to filter that request to say, all right, only return me records that meet this criteria, or only return me records that have changed in the last 10 minutes or last day. What webhooks allow us to do, and the support we have now, is rather than us having to pull that data, we can now go ahead and allow it to send that push request to us and say, hey, this record has changed. Let's go ahead and run an integration based off of that. So if you've utilized SmartConnect a lot to this point, you'll know that we have real-time data sources and real-time triggers for a lot of our dedicated connections. So if you're working with SQL, Business Central, CRM, Salesforce, NetSuite, etc., we've got those real-time triggers built in there when you build your data source. Webhooks are essentially the real-time data source or real-time trigger for our generic REST API connector. So this opens up a whole nother window of, or a whole nother path in terms of how you design integrations. They can now be built more in a way that's more similar to how you build them with our dedicated connectors, because you can do these real-time types of interaction with that data. And again, I talked about the pushing versus pulling data. That also ties into kind of the benefits of webhooks in the sense that, like I just mentioned, it is real-time interaction. So rather than us waiting to pull every 10 minutes or every hour or whatever the schedule we set up or that frequency, now it's when that event occurs, that system is actually pushing the data to us. Now, I put a star on there because like everything, there is more details to it. And in this case, it means it's, I wanted to note that it's asynchronous. And what this means, if you're looking at a system and you're saying, hey, it's a real-time event, it's true that it's real-time because the moment that event occurs, webhook will fire and send that request to SmartConnect. But it's asynchronous in the sense that it doesn't hang up that system that had the webhook. So it's not waiting on a response back from us when it fires. So the user's going about their day, they create a new order, a new customer, or a new ticket in whatever system, and there's a webhook tied to that, that will in real time send that event off, but we're not waiting for that response. So the event occurs in real time, but there's not that delay to say, hey, was this successful or not? So that's where we say it's asynchronous. It's running in the background without tying up any of the UI for the user, so they don't notice any delay or any performance issues there. Now, there's a big benefit in the sense of, especially if you're looking at e-commerce or web stores, a lot of times you want to get that information immediately, right? If someone's on that web store and they go ahead and say, all right, create a customer or create that order and send that through and they hit submit, we want to see once that new order is created, it immediately flowing across, hitting SmartConnect, and then sending it into your ERP or wherever else you want that to integrate to. So that's a large benefit to how this is going to run. The other thing that's a benefit, and I've kind of alluded to it as I've been talking about pulling data versus having it pushed, is we get to control the amount of data we're processing, right? So if we're pulling that data on a schedule, say, every 10 minutes, every hour, once a day, we're generally pulling a lot more information. And sometimes we might be pulling records we don't need to over and over because we're not able to push just the recently created or just the newly updated record. So this allows us to essentially get it down to one record at a time. Once we see that event occur in that system, trigger an integration off of that. Now, there's a couple things I want to talk about here because at this point, it seems like, hey, we should use webhooks for everything. But there's always considerations that we need to have in mind. And this is kind of my last part of the agenda item on additional considerations, what we want to look for as we're designing these. Now, one particular case where we may not want to use a webhook is if that system we're pulling that data from is having massive amounts of updates going through. They're doing mass updates to records fairly frequently. Because what's going to happen is if they have another process that goes and updates, let's say, 5,000 records at a time, each one of those that gets updated, if we have an event and a webhook on it, is going to try to call an individual integration and push that off to SmartConnect. Now, would it work? Yes. But is it efficient? Probably not in that case because you're doing 5,000 individual calls as it's being sent out. So if you have a system that's having mass updates or mass creation of records occurring frequently, in that case, you probably want to keep it with the method that you'd be using before now, where we actually have a scheduled process and we send that request to their API and we say, all right, pull all these records that have been modified in the last, X amount of time. So in that case, we're only sending it through, or in that case, we're not running, 5,000 individual integration runs. We're running one larger integration that's dealing with a larger amount of data one time at a scheduled interval. So it's things like that you want to keep in mind to say, all right, how many times is this system being updated? What does it look like? Is it user or is it another system or automated process that's doing those updates or those creations? And then kind of build and design your integrations off of that as you go along. All right, I'm checking for questions, chat. I don't see anything at this time. Again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop it in there as we're going through. But if not, I will continue on here. So we're going to start aiming a little bit more towards the technical side of this now. And we start talking about, one, determining if the REST API is webhooks and then how we subscribe to it. So if you already know what webhooks are, you know how to subscribe, everything up to this point, it's probably been a little boring. If you haven't, hopefully you've got a solid foundation of at least that general idea as we're looking at it. But determining if a REST API has webhooks is going to be something that requires doing just a little bit of digging. And normally that's going to be looking through that product's documentation. Now I've got two examples I'm going to pull up. I've got both a Zendesk environment and its documentation, and then I've got a Shopify environment and documentation around it. And I'll show you an example of each and what you'd be looking at in terms of how that fits together. So if you guys have sat through, or if you've seen my I can't remember if the one that's out there is by me or someone else on our team, but I've done it a few times with our REST API and what makes a good REST API and if we can connect to it or not. That ties in very closely to this idea. Because in SmartConnect, what you're going to see is our webhook configuration where we set up and subscribe to a webhook, that falls under our REST connector. So everything that we cover in that webinar is going to apply to this in terms of, can we interact with that API? Does it have an authentication type we support? What's the payload look like? Is it JSON or XML or something else? And what are the web methods we can interact with? Same idea carries over to this in terms of, let's find the documentation, let's look to see if they have anything documented about webhooks, and then see if they have anything that actually defines what their different webhooks are and what we're able to subscribe to. So I want to show two examples on that because it's important to see how different systems document it, because there's not really a standard in terms of documentation. It's however much effort that particular application or that particular system puts into that. Additionally, there are different types of webhooks. And when I say different types, this has a couple meanings. One is the different type of events that can occur, right? Is it a webhook that fires off of both inserts or creations and updates? Do they have a different webhook for new records versus updated records? Do they have a webhook that handles delete events? Do they tie everything together into a generic one? So there's different events a webhook can fire off of. And then the other half of it is there's different, what I would call a payload. Webhooks can send a different payload. So there's different data that gets sent with the webhook to the systems that are subscribed to it. And what I mean by that is some webhooks will bundle the actual payload, the whole record that got changed, and you can pass that through. And then there's others that might send very minimal information. They might send just the keys or the GUIDs of the records that changed. And you have to go back and tie that into another API call to get the rest of that information. So like I said, it can get fairly in-depth when you start looking at the details of it, but that's what we're trying to handle in SmartConnect to say, doesn't matter if they give you all the data, some of it, all events, just one webhook per event. We've got different setup options that will let you configure it to tie into exactly what you need. So with that, like I said, I will go ahead and look at my documentation here. So I've got a few different tabs open, so I'm gonna hop around a little bit. I'm not gonna go into SmartConnect quite yet. I'm gonna stick with the actual documentation. So like I mentioned, we've got Zendesk as one of them and Shopify as the other. I'm fairly certain most people have heard of both. If they haven't, a very quick rundown of it is Zendesk is an online help portal. They've got 3 main record types you'd be dealing with in there. You've got organizations, which would be like companies or accounts or customers. You've got users, which would be your users tied to that company or that organization, which corresponds to contacts. And then you've got tickets, and those tickets normally would correspond to a case or potentially create an invoice off of a ticket depending on the ticket type, if you're thinking of integrating it to another system. For Shopify, that's a web store and e-commerce platform. So I'm not gonna go through that in depth. Everyone, for the most part, knows what components are involved in an e-com platform. But I wanted to show a couple of things here because it's important to know what we're looking at from a documentation perspective. And I opened the Zendesk one first, and my default is to go and find their API reference, right? So to dig through that, this is where I could go ahead and find all the different endpoints for if I was setting up my REST connector to Zendesk. And I was hoping I could find something on webhooks inside of here as I was going through. And to the best of my knowledge, I didn't actually have a link in their API reference that linked me out to their webhook documentation. So that's something I found a little annoying as I was prepping for this, but I decided to go ahead and list it here because it might be something that requires you to do a little bit more searching. So they've actually got a separate documentation portal just for webhooks in here that say, all right, here's how we get started. Here's how we can go ahead and subscribe to them and the different types that we'd be working with. So if you look at the webhook event types, this takes us into their API reference again, but the different events are going to be what you might call like a trigger, right? And I've been talking about like if a record is created, a record is updated, something gets changed on it. And they've broken it down into like organization and user events, and I believe they've got a ticket event somewhere as well that I'm not quite seeing here. But if we drill into one of the user events on there, they've actually done a very good job of listing all the different events they support by default in Zendesk that they have a webhook that you can enable on. So again, when I talk about Zendesk, the user can be either like the end user tied to an organization, or it can be the actual user agent within the system that's hosting Zendesk. So you can see that they do webhooks and they drill down into the detail to say, all right, if a specific attribute or a specific field on that object changed, they have an individual webhook for that. So that you're not going to find in every system that you work with. But if you do find something like this, it allows you a lot of granular control over when you determine an event should fire and when we should get a notification in SmartConnect to run an integration. Because you might only care about a handful of fields, so you could go ahead and set something up on just the details off of this. Same idea at their organization, well, not quite as granular at the organization level, but in that case, the organization or the customer or the account level, a lot of times you're going to look at like it being created or it being updated or something on here changing, and we're going to have an event off of that. Now, Zendesk has another thing you can utilize. I'm not going to go into it here because it's not a full product train and this isn't Zendesk specific, but they allow you to also set up custom triggers within Zendesk to say, all right, if it matches all these triggers, fire off a webhook that you want along with the data you want to send on there. So they give you a lot of control over it. Now, the other system I wanted to look at was Shopify. And when I looked at their API reference, I've got all that listed here, so I could go ahead and find anything I want from my standard REST connector on pulling or sending data into their API. But they've also got the webhook portion embedded right in here. And this is generally what I like to see or expect. I guess it doesn't matter, it's my opinion. It just makes more sense to me to have the documentation all in one place so I can see what they're doing here. Now, a lot of times, like in this case, they're going to give you more information than what we need for SmartConnect, because what they've got in here is they've got a very nice definition of how their webhooks work and what it means. So like, if you guys want more information on it, you can read through, webhook definitions or look at documentation like this, and they generally do a good job of saying why you'd want to use it and what it's doing. But my point on here was they're giving us more information than we need. So they've got this hooked up through their main API to say they could actually manage their webhooks through the API, which we don't need to do. What we're interested in is figuring out what webhooks or what events we can tie to, which is going to be that final option on here, so we can see these coming through. So you can see, like for an e-commerce platform, they deal a lot with shopping carts, checkouts. If we go down here, we've got the overall company level, and then even like the customer, and you can see they break that out into create, update, and delete, which is nice because then we know that there's different events that we can tie to. So we can say, all right, if we only cared about, well, that's customer groups, customers. If we only cared about new customers syncing over, we could do that and ignore the update if we wanted to. Now, while we're in the documentation, I told you guys this was going to get a little technical as we're going through. One thing that's really useful to find wherever you're at is the actual payload that's being sent. So Shopify does this very nicely with their documentation, where that any one of these you expand, you can go ahead and see, all right, for my customer create webhook, this is the payload or the data that's being sent when that webhook fires. And this information is what we need inside of SmartConnect when we go and set that up, because we need to know what fields are coming across so we know where we can map that to when we use it in our integration itself. So I'll take a moment here. Let me check to see if there's any questions. The only question I see, someone had to drop for a meeting conflict. I'm asking if there'd be a recording later on. Yes, there will be. If you signed up for this event, you'll get that recording that you can access later as well. All right, see if any other questions come through. Otherwise, I will. All right, don't see anything else here. All right, so where we left it off, again, looking at the actual events that are occurring in the documentation, finding out if an API supports those. If you see something like this and say, hey, here's the webhook section, here's what events they support, then the answer would be yes, that API has webhooks, which means we could utilize them as part of our SmartConnect process. Now, the other thing I mentioned that is very useful and nice to have, well, not nice to have, it's needed in the sense you need to know what that webhook is sending for the payload, whether it's sending you all the data or just a lot of them will just do an ID and like an event ID to say, hey, something occurred, and we have to query out the rest of that. So now we'll take it, actually flip over to SmartConnect. I'm not going to flip back to slides. If I did, the next slide says, hey, subscribing to a webhook. Let's take a look at SmartConnect. So I'm just going to go there immediately. So within SmartConnect, and if you haven't seen it, I apologize, I'm not going to be able to step through everything here. If you haven't, there's plenty of other resources and webinars to get you familiar with the UI. But for webhooks themselves, they actually fall under our REST service section. So I've mentioned it a couple times in the sense that we built our REST connector quite a few years ago to allow us to build out connections to REST APIs that we did not have a dedicated connector for. This is expanding on that, and we've been expanding on this REST connector every year, adding in additional functionality. And this is probably the largest feature we've added to date that wasn't included initially. So got a couple examples. I'm utilizing one of my, it's on a live region. I'm actually hitting our UK region here today because I liked what we had set up in here from one of our QA guys. So we've got an example of both Shopify and an example of Zendesk and how that ties together. So if I was to open up one of these, you'll get a very impromptu and brief REST connector, overview or training, just so we know what everything is doing inside of here. But the main idea is for REST connector, you set it up to a REST API, you get the base URL in there, you get to choose what the authentication method we utilize when we're sending that through. And then once you have that set, up till this last release, what we were able to do is define either our data source, so where we want to get that information from, and your destination, where we want to send that to. Now what we have, there we go, let me change my zoom a little bit. What we have added now is that webhook section. So it falls under the REST connector. You can utilize this without using the standard data source or destination, because like I mentioned earlier in the call here, or earlier in the webinar here, this data source side is that pulling of information, right? We're reaching out to the API, we're hitting the endpoint, and we're pulling a set of data back, and we can filter it down with query parameters or anything else that the API allows us to do. Webhooks are that option where we don't necessarily need to do this because we can set it up to subscribe to that push information. Now, what I'm going to do in here is take a look at our customers one that's already been configured. There's a handful of sections in here that is defined details, but with this, a lot of times you need to do some stuff on the source system or the source application to configure that webhook, because we have to tell it where to send that information to. So a couple things I want to point out while I'm in here, like I've mentioned, is a couple times I've talked about whether or not that webhook is going to send that full set of data, or if it's just going to send an ID or a link for us to work with. Now, if it just has that link we want to work with, that's where we can go ahead and configure the data source as well. Now, the data source, what that's going to correspond to is, if I go back just a moment, is going to be inside of here. So you can tell it's one of my QA guys' environments because we'll have some random names in there. But if you've configured it to pull information off their standard endpoints, so like the get customer endpoint in this case, if the webhook was only sending you that customer ID, inside of here, you could link our customer endpoint, that call, to this webhook. So when the webhook sent the ID, SmartConnect would know, all right, that's the ID of the record I need to look up, and then go ahead and link it back to the main API call without us having to do anything else. Additionally, what we can do on the response is some of them will require you to send a response back. Some webhooks do, not a lot of them, but we put this option in here too. So if they need a callback to say, hey, we received your webhook push notification, that's where that can be configured in here. Neither Shopify or Zendesk require it, but a few of the other systems we tested with do. Finally, the data source fields on here determine what fields we parse into SmartConnect so we can actually handle the mapping. Now, what we're able to do is that information I showed on here, this you can just save to a JSON file, pull it out, save it in a text file, put the extension as .json on there, and then when you get into here, you can just load this information from file, and SmartConnect's going to figure out all the field names and the different paths within that JSON. So again, I know I'm flipping back and forth a bit, but if we look at this and you can go ahead and, it ends up nesting a little bit, right? So we've got our main bracket here that's got all these fields, but then once we get down to default address, it's got fields under default address. SmartConnect, you can see that when we import that file, it puts that little period there to denote that it's traversing through that JSON payload, getting the correct path for us. So that just needs to be dropped inside of here. Now, what we're able to do when we set, this is the definition we're setting up. So just because we put it in here in this definition area doesn't mean we've actually got it configured fully yet. This is just taking the documentation that we had, knowing there's an event on there, and then saying what to do with that. What we can do here after that's configured, and it's a similar idea in Zendesk, but I'll step through that in a moment. But what we can do then is we can then go to the real-time data source section, and this is where we end up setting up the specific real-time source based on that definition we created in that maintenance window. So if I go in here, I'm going to go ahead and filter this down to say, all right, let's look at our Shopify webhooks. I'm going to edit the one we've currently got. So this is utilizing our REST connector, which our person named Shopify webhooks. The one we just looked at and the only one that was set up on there was customers. And we can say who we want to run this as it's going through. So we can run it as a number of different users set up within SmartConnect. Now, when we go ahead and set this up, what we get down here, and this is important, is the callback URL. Now, this is required to be used on the source system or the source application. So in this case, we're talking about Shopify. So the webhook in Shopify needs to know where to send its webhook event to. So if you don't set up this and grab this from here, and you can always come back in later and get it because obviously I just opened this up to edit it. We need to grab that and then go finish our webhook setup on the actual source application. And this is going to be true with whatever system you work with. You have to tell it where you're sending the data to. And a lot of systems, you might have a webhook. They might have a webhook that sends to, multiple different environments. It might be sending to SmartConnect, might be sending something else off to another API, might be feeding into like a warehouse system as well. So webhooks can send that data to a lot of locations, which is why it's not like a one-to-one link there. So if I go into the Shopify environment, and we'll look at this one specifically, if I go to settings, and then this is where you're gonna have to follow the documentation because they might name stuff differently. They've actually got their webhook information located under notifications on here, and then webhooks fall under that. So when we drill through this, we can see that there's actually a few different ones that they've set up to this point for the customer creation. And again, since I'm utilizing one of my QA members' environments, he's doing this across the EQA environments. There's an E1 environment, there's EU, US, NA2. So you can see that we've got one Shopify environment, and these are all off the customer creation, sending them to different SmartConnect environments to test out. Now, when we go in here, we could go ahead and we could create a new one if we wanted, and we could say what event we're subscribing to. Since we've set up the definition for the customer create event, I'm just going to edit an existing one so I could show you what the setup looks like. So you've got the event, you've got the format we're sending. We support JSON for our webhooks currently. And then you've got that URL so it knows where it needs to be sending that to. And that's what we grabbed from our data source setup window. Now, I know if you're watching closely, it doesn't exactly match, and I'm not going to change it because I know he still uses this for testing. But this one's pointed at our NA server, and if you look at mine, this is our UK server as part of the path on here. But this is so the webhook knows where it needs to fire off that event to, that we'd be subscribed to, so that when it occurs, we can see that flow through. Now, once it's set up like this and you've actually got configured, some systems like here actually let you send a test, so you can send essentially a fake event through to make sure that's gonna send. We can receive it in our system and see it on our end. Once we have it in here, it still technically doesn't do anything until we tie this real-time source to an integration. So in this case, you can see linked integrations. We've already got one that's up, say, Shopify customer webhook that it's tied to. And just to show that once we have that configured as our real-time source, it works like any other integration that we've got configured. So for testing, I didn't have time to switch this off from a file, but I really just wanted to show the data source side of it and what that looks like in an integration. Because at this point, once your configuration is done, once you've done that REST setup and you've actually subscribed to it and put that in the originating system, the source works just like any other source. We can find that in our real-time event under our Shopify webhook. We tie it in here. And then when we go ahead and look at doing the actual field mapping, we have the different events we're passing through as part of the fields that we want to work with. So there's the actual map setup when it gets to that portion of it. This works exactly the same as any other data source or destination combination that you can think of. It's the maintenance side of it that takes a few more steps to make sure we can subscribe in the right way. Now, I know this is fairly technical that we're digging through, but I also want to show at least quickly what it looks like on the Zendesk side, just to illustrate that this process is going to differ on the source system depending on what we're working with. So in Zendesk itself, I drilled into the admin center for Zendesk because my chat's disconnected. I drilled into my admin center from there to get in here. And now they've actually got a section under apps and integrations where they just call it webhooks, just straight up. So it's a little bit easier to find in here. Now, if you're doing one of these, you can go ahead and see that. If you remember back earlier in the webinar, they've got different events across like changing a user or changing an organization, and you can really drill down to individual fields changing on there. But if I go ahead and take a look at one of these webhooks on here, what I talked about is the difference in the setup on the source application side from system to system. So for Zendesk, you can subscribe to one of their default events, which is what I showed you guys as part of the documentation here. Everything listed here for the user events, this is what they would call, one of their Zendesk events or one of their default events. I also mentioned you could go ahead and set up your own triggers and criteria in Zendesk to say, all right, it needs to match this and this and this and this before it sends an event off, and that's what the other one would be. But once again, as you go through it, you get down to the main section here where you still end up plugging in our endpoint URL and tying that to SmartConnect as we subscribe to it so we know what's occurring. And just briefly, if I was going to show here, I was intending to keep this to half an hour, but I do like to chat. So if I was to look at our Zendesk webhook real quick and take a look at the setup for this, you can see we've got a couple different ones set up here on either the users changing or a ticket status changing. If we drill into it, kind of the same idea on here. So in this case, it does contain data, so we don't have to worry about that. The difference on here that we've got configured compared to the other one is we can say, all right, that webhook does tell us what event type is part of it. And once again, I know this isn't a full product training, so we're not going to go through every setting, but this is an important one in there to say, all right, if there's the same type of event that's firing from that source application and you want to have different things occur, whether it's create or update or delete, if that webhook has the event type in there, in this case Zendesk does, we can filter it down to say, all right, this definition only applies for updates. And if we get in a create event coming through, we can have that defined on a different webhook and a different definition. So we could have different integrations run based off of different events on the same object that's changing. So again, I know it gets a little bit into the weeds, a little bit technical, a little bit of the details, but this is very cool and very powerful in terms of setting up your integrations. So with that, again, I'll look for some questions if they're coming through. So if anyone has any questions in general, let me know. All right, so we've got some coming through. Awesome. Do I have an example of the webhook setup and REST definition where it contains links? I don't have that available on this this environment. I apologize for that. What we are doing though is we're expanding our documentation on our E1 site. So we've got 2 different examples created. They haven't been published yet. That will go beyond the normal documentation just of, hey, this field does this, this field does this. They'll actually walk you through subscribing both to Zendesk and Shopify. I'll make sure that the team is working on one that has an example of one that has links as well, so you can kind of have a step-by-step as well on that. Another question is digging in, what do we want to do and where do we want to go when we want to dig in deeper to configuring webhooks. So there's going to be a couple answers to that. One, we do a advanced REST connector training currently. And to this point, that's dug into the REST connector just in general. Around it, we are going to expand on that to include we're going to expand on that to go ahead and include a webhook portion of the training. I don't know if it will be included in that or it'll be separate, but it's definitely something we're going to offer, because this, as you can see, as I've just kind of walked through on the webinar, this can get fairly hands-on and fairly in-depth as we're going through it. And we've tried to build in a lot of different options to handle those different configurations that you run across. The other answer I'd have to that is you can always send a question into the E1 team. I think I forgot to put an email on this webinar itself, but you can always reach out to sales@e1solutions.com. And we've got a number of different team members, both on the service team, support team, and pre-sales team that our sales team can reach out to and do a call if needed, or at least get you an answer on anything that you'd be looking at. Other question I see in here is, does Magento use these type of events? I don't know off the top of my head. I will check quick, and just to keep me from blindly searching around on the webinar, I'm going to go ahead and see if I can find it. All right, so based on what I'm seeing, they do. Now, Magento's fun because they've kind of changed their name. So their documentation around it, or their, what they call is the Adobe Commerce now for webhooks. So I haven't looked at this myself. So just the high level, they've got documentation on it. So it says it's in here. I haven't spent time personally going through to know how we'd set this up yet, but I believe it'd be a similar process if we can find, you know, the body or the payload that's being sent through the event we subscribe to. So yes, the short answer is Magento does utilize webhooks. The long answer is it would take some more research to figure out what specific events they have, and then making sure that we subscribe to them, just like we did with the others on the call here. Awesome, great questions as we've been running through here. Once again, I want to thank everyone that was on here live and for your participation and questions. That always makes these enjoyable and fun for myself. Again, I mentioned you can always reach out to sales@e1solutions.com. They can go ahead and loop in whoever we need from our team if you have specific questions on an API and whether we can connect to it in general, whether it has webhooks, or if you're looking for more information on this, they can help direct you in where to go. If you're watching this as a recording, same thing applies to anyone that's watching this at a later date. Thank you for your time and attention during this. And yeah, I hope everyone has a great day wherever they are at. And yeah, thank you for your time.